chapter, beginning with the 13th verse. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or another of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. So Jesus is on the road with his disciples. And one of the ways Jesus taught his disciples was by asking questions. So he asked them a question. "Who do people say I am?" And they go, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist returned. Others that you're Elijah returned, or one of the other prophets." And all of these things were said about Jesus. But then Jesus says, "What about you? You should know me better than anyone else." Some of them were former disciples of John the Baptist, so they knew he wasn't John the Baptist. "Who do you say I am?" And, of course, it's Simon Peter who answers. That's just like Simon. The other disciples don't really want to answer this question. Teacher asks a question and you don't raise your hand even though you think you know the answer because you might be wrong, or you don't want to look like a show off in front of the other students. That never bothered Peter. Peter he wouldn't think. He would act without thinking. He would speak without thinking. Jesus asks a question. Peter just blurts out an answer. Most of the time, Peter's wrong when he just blurts out an answer. This time, he's right. And it's almost like Jesus is shocked that of all his disciples, Peter's the one who gets the answer right, because he says, "That wasn't revealed to you by man. God had to give you that answer." Sometimes when I've been substitute teaching, I thought, God had to give the student that answer because there's no way they should have known it. Not them. That's what Jesus is saying to Peter here. How is it you? And it must have been God that picked you to answer this question. And then Jesus gives Peter a name change. He calls him by his given name, Simon, son of Jonah. In Aramaic, that's Shimon bar Jonas. That was the given name. If they had birth certificates back then, it would have been the name on his birth certificate. But from this moment on, Jesus calls him Peter most of the time. And Peter is not even a Jewish name, and it's not an Aramaic name. It's a Greek name. And it means the rock. So he says, "You are Peter. And on this rock, on Peter, I'm going to build my church." Now, why? Why is Jesus picking Peter as the one to build his church on? What qualifications does he have? Well, he probably has no formal education. He was a fisherman. And as we just mentioned, he does so many things without stopping to think about what's going to happen if he does it. I mean, look, they're in the boat, Jesus is walking on water, Peter gets out and walks on the water. And then, of course, he sinks. Didn't stop to think. They're at the Last Supper, and Jesus gets out the basin and the towel and starts washing the disciples' feet, and Peter is the only one who speaks up to object to it. Again, he didn't stop to think, maybe Jesus is trying to teach us something here. He just, that's wrong, you shouldn't be doing this, why are you doing it? Don't do it to me. They're in the garden later that night. The soldiers come to arrest Jesus, and Peter from somewhere pulls out a sword and attacks. Jesus has to stop Peter and heals the man he attacked. Jesus is arrested. Peter follows. And somebody recognizes him and he denies that he ever knew Jesus. This is who Jesus chose to build the church on? Someone who denies him, someone who's impulsive, someone who's rash, someone who doesn't stop to think. But what if we took all those characteristics of Peter I just mentioned and try to think of them positively? What is the one characteristic Peter has which none of the other disciples appear to be displayed? Peter is bold. He's fearless. He'll get out of the boat and walk on water because he's not afraid when he's looking at Jesus. He'll pull his sword, resolved to either free Jesus or die trying. It's boldness. That is Peter's virtue. And that is the virtue that Jesus wants to instill in the church by building it on Peter. The church needs to be bold. And we look historically and we see this is true. Within a generation of Jesus' death, the church will be persecuted, really starting immediately afterwards, persecuted by the Jewish authorities. Within a generation, persecuted across the entire empire by the imperial authorities. And every time the church is persecuted, every time martyrs are made, the church grows. Every time the apostles are told to sit down and be quiet, they preach the gospel louder. Every time a church congregation is shut down and the people are forced to scatter, they spread the gospel to the corners of the earth. The disciples, the apostles, became men who boldly took risks, who carried the gospel in spite of persecution, in spite of beatings, in spite of imprisonment, in spite of death. And eventually, it took almost 300 years, but eventually, the power of the Roman Empire failed and submitted to the power of Christ. Caesar had been proclaimed as a god, and every emperor from Caesar onward until Constantine maintained that lie that they had become divine when they became emperor. Constantine became emperor in the name of Christ. "300 years of boldness, 300 years of martyrdom, 300 years of persecution, and the church overcame." And moving on, after the position of the church was secure in Rome, Christian missionaries continued into Africa and Asia and parts of Europe outside of Roman influence, and eventually to the New World. Brave men and women going boldly, carrying the gospel, offering the message of forgiveness to people hostile to it. That's historically the boldness that the church needed. And that is the boldness the church still needs. That is the boldness the church is still called to. Jesus says something interesting. After he says, "I'm going to build the church on you," he goes, "and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." A lot of times we think of our churches as safe spaces. This is a place for Christians to gather safely and worship. The church's job is to take care of the believers. But that's not the image Jesus is giving here. The gates of Hades, in terms of armies, in terms of military, Jesus is saying that the church is going to take the offensive against the powers of sin and death, against Satan. It is not just the job of the church to protect the faithful from the powers of Satan. It is the job of the church to take the fight to the enemy, to attack Satan in his strongholds. That requires boldness. That requires the minister, the female minister, who goes to the strip clubs, stands in the parking lot and prays, talks to the dancers when they come out on their smoke breaks, and shares scripture with them, and listens to their stories, and offers them a way out. I know that minister. And she's gotten death threats from bar and club owners because she's taking away their business and their money. She's getting the dancers to quit. And she told me one time, we were at a pastor's meeting, and somebody asked how she can walk into such bold places, such dark places so boldly. And she said, God told me that wherever I am, He is with me. And if He is with me, wherever I am is holy ground. And I have nothing to fear on holy ground. That is the boldness the church is called to. Satan's already lost, but he's not given up. There's no way he can win, but he's still fighting. Our job is not just to protect the faithful, it is to rescue the lost. It is not just to resist the devil, it is to foil his schemes. Peter was chosen as the rock of the church because in spite of all his flaws, he was bold. Let the church be bold. Our closing hymn is number 487, Room at the Cross for You.